Governor Scott Walker, thanks for sitting down with us. It's been a few weeks. You've been in office 11 weeks.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting weeks, hasn't it been? Does it feel like 11 months or 11 years? Or
Well, yeah, I told a group yesterday it's been 4 months since the election, and sometimes it seems like 4 years because so much is going on, so much has happened. Probably the biggest surprise was just all the national attention. We knew
international too?
Well, really, yeah. In fact, I had one of the exchange students of some good friends of ours in Wauwatosa. It's from Sweden, and her mother sent a picture that was on the front page of the Swedish paper last month about what was going on here in Wisconsin. So yeah, I had no idea it would become as international, I guess, as it ended up being. But I knew from my years in Milwaukee County, anytime you take on the status quo, you try and change things, that they're going to be defenders of the status quo. We're going to get worked up. So partially, I wasn't surprised. Just in terms of how big it got nationally and internationally, yeah, that part surprised me.
The collective bargaining bill, it's now caught between the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, Governor. If it takes a while to resolve, doesn't that mean you won't have the $30 million additional payments for health care and pensions April, May, and June, sir?
Well, it won't happen right away. Obviously, it depends on how long that delay is. My guess is, just looking at the way the court operates, is that you potentially could have a delay of a week or two, and that would adjust. But those savings were from the first week of April all the way through the end of June. And so a week or two won't make a significant difference. Obviously, if it went in months further beyond the point when we originally planned implementation, that would have an impact. But my hope is it's in the end, this is a matter of timing delay. It's not a matter of this ultimately not being the law. It will be the law. It's just a question of when.
So you would hope it would get, the Supreme Court would rule in only a matter of weeks?
Well, not only the Supreme Court, because really the Supreme Court, and I'm not a lawyer, so I follow other lawyers, but as I understand, that's really about the temporary restraining order, whether or not they can do that, and that's why the Court of Appeals said this has got to be resolved because there's a lot of implications far beyond this specific case. Next week, the Circuit Court could actually take the arguments in the specific case beyond the temporary restraining order and ultimately make a decision, and that could be acted on much more quickly. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I actually have read the law in this case, ironically a law that in part rules that were written by several of the current state senators who were around several decades ago, and the law seems pretty clear that what the legislature did was accurate.
Okay, so you don't buy the Dane County DA's claim that the open meetings law was violated?
No, I think the rules are pretty clear. Now, people can argue whether they like that law or not, but a judge at any level doesn't get to make a new law. If the law is clear, and I think it is abundantly clear, and again, you look at two of the senators who are currently there as Democrats right now, they were the people who helped write that law. So I think the law is pretty clear. They use it. It's why the Senate Chief Clerk gave the advice, a person who's given advice to Democrat and Republican majorities alike, so it's not someone who's a partisan. And I think it's pretty clear they were on the right side of it.
The judge in the case, Judge Sumi and the Dane County DA and the lawyers for the public employee unions have all said that the ledge could have a do-over, could just pass the law again. Is it time for a do-over, Governor?
No, again, I think it is clear. I mean, that's an option. But in the end, if people did something legally, why do they need to change when the law is clear? And if the law is enforced, ultimately the law will stand that was passed that I signed into law 2 weeks ago.
Supreme Court election, April 5. The supporters of Joanne Kloppenburg seem to want to make it a referendum on you and your policies. Has it become a referendum on you, sir?
No, I mean, they're trying to do that, but I think in the end, any good judicial election, be it for the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, or a local circuit court, should really be about someone's qualifications and whether they're capable of upholding the law, starting with the Constitution of the state, and the statutes that are passed by the legislature, Democrat, Republican alike, and ultimately signed or acted on by a governor. They shouldn't be about a specific policy issue here or any issues in the past. And so I think most voters in this state will look at it that way. Certainly will drive the turnout of some of the people who are trying to make this a referendum, but it's not a referendum. Judicial races aren't.
Do you plan to help David Prosser win?
In our case, we're focused on getting this budget. For us, it's important to work on the budget for the next several months. We're focused on that. We're focused on helping those state lawmakers in those 3 seats that are open for the state assembly, and in whatever recall elections might be out there, helping them move forward, because again, long term, that helps us get the state working again.
The third-party ad that says Scott Walker and David Prosser, when they were in the assembly, voted like 95% of the time. Do you think that's true, sir?
I have no idea. Most of those ads, we don't know where they draw things up from. But again, this is not a vote on whether or not the justice was a good lawmaker or not. This is about whether or not the two candidates are qualified. And when you look at someone like the justice who's been on the court for about a dozen years versus a candidate, as I understand it, who was passed over for appointments to judicial positions by Jim Doyle and Barack Obama, as well as Tommy Thompson in the past, I think voters have to look at those facts more so than where someone's voting record was at some point prior to a judicial appointment.
You and Justice Prosser served in the Assembly for 4 years. You were elected special election in 93. He left in 96. How closely did you work with then Speaker Prosser?
Well, just as closely as anybody else out there. I mean, I served with Fred Risser during that time period as well. In fact, Justice Prosser probably spent more time in his legislative career with Fred Risser than he did with me in terms of tenure out there. Again, elections for judges at any level, Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, Circuit Court, should ultimately be about someone's qualifications.
You going to vote for Justice Prosser?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's a qualified, for the same reason you've had former governors, both Democrats and Republicans alike, who have endorsed him and supported his campaign and said this is someone who's competent.
16 state senators are the subject of drives to be recalled. 8 Dems, 8 Republicans. If there are some of those elections, would you campaign for some of the GOP senators like Dan Kapanke, Alberta Darling, and Randy Hoppers?
Yeah, I mean, for me, first off, I think recall elections in general should be narrowly focused, but they're ultimately determined by the people. To me, I think the recall process, the statute out there, is really narrowly targeted for people where there's a situation of misconduct in office, things of that nature. Certainly is an issue I looked at years ago. Back in 2002 when there was a big pension scandal in Milwaukee County, and I came in, ended up being a special election, but originally started out as a recall. That's where you had an abuse of power, where there was a specific act. It wasn't just about an issue, it was about the whole process. In this case, certainly I'd campaign for those individuals for 2 reasons. One, just on principle. I think voters have every opportunity to put in office or take out of office people they disagree with on votes at general elections. If you don't like how someone voted on an issue, then wait till the next election. If you like a candidate running against them, vote for that person, support that person. I don't think recalls in general should be used just as specific referendum issues on one issue or another. In the larger context, though, the big reason why any of those folks who had the courage, and I mean courage not just in political terms, but I mean literally, physically had the courage because of so many of the reports we've had of threats, death threats, attacks, even nails on the driveway and all those other things, and yet had the courage to do what they believe they were elected to do. And for each of those senators who stood up and did that to protect middle-class jobs and middle-class taxpayers, I think I owe it to not only them, but I think I owe it to the taxpayers of the state to stand up and help them.
If there are elections to toss out of office some of the Democrats, would you campaign against Democrats like Hansen, Wirch, and Hoperenser? In
my case, I'm really going to stay focused on supporting those senators who ultimately, like I said, had the courage to stand up and protect the middle class. You know, there's a lot of talk by people who've been around this Capitol protesting about the middle class, and yet the reality is middle class taxpayers who are the ones who get stuck paying for more and more and more government year after year after year. What we did with these budget reforms and what we're doing with this budget by having a balanced budget with no tax increases, including an absolute freeze on property taxes, is saying once and for all, we're not standing on the side of more special interest and more government spending. We're standing on the side of the taxpayers, middle-class taxpayers, who traditionally picked up the tab here. I'm going to help support those lawmakers, in this case those senators, who ultimately stood up for those middle-class taxpayers.
Your reaction to the University of Wisconsin system chancellors who wrote the letter this week, give each of us more autonomy on our own campuses and keep the system together. Don't split off Madison. Is that something you would consider?
You know, in February, I sat literally in this room around this table and had all the chancellors in. In fact, we've been doing a lot of other business beyond just the budget repair bill. And I told them at that time why my budget was going to include the authority for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but that I was open to having that same sort of authority for campuses all across the state. Because for the past couple of years, when I literally campaigned and stopped in all but one of the campuses. One I wasn't able to get to, but all the other campuses, met with the chancellors, talked to them before, I've talked to them again back in February about this and said, absolutely, we should give them the flexibility when it comes to hiring, when it comes to running their campus more like a business, when it comes to procurement and purchasing and construction. Because when we do that, more of the money, they can save money, put more of that money in the classroom, put it behind instruction and research and all the other things that make our campuses great. I said the big challenge was early on, right after the election, because Chancellor Martin and others from Madison had talked about this for years. Mm-hmm. We approached them and said, are you serious? And they said, absolutely. They came in, put the work behind the product, and gave us the information we needed to carve out an authority for them. It wasn't until late in the game when the University of Wisconsin systems officials came in, and we really didn't have the capacity to put that in the budget. But I told the chancellors there that I'd work with them and lawmakers in both political parties from across the state to work on a larger authority concept to help all of our campuses.
But you still believe that UW-Madison should be split off, correct?
Well, in this case, if we can make it work in the larger context, we're willing to do that. Okay. But I don't want to see the benefits that we're giving to Madison to allow them to move forward, which is really not only our flagship, but a major economic development engine, not only in terms of putting out some of the best and the brightest when it comes to degrees, but also in terms of the research. And I mean, we've got $1 billion worth of R&D that comes out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We need to make sure we protect that and grow that and use that as an economic engine for this state. So as in any of the adjustments that are made to the budget, as long as we protect their ability to be strong, we're willing to work with lawmakers to make that happen.
The Madison Chancellor wrote a letter yesterday saying, if we are set free and get our own authority, which would be governed by 21 members, 11 of which you would appoint,
right.
As you know,
yeah.
The fall tuition increase might be 8.5%. Is that a number that you don't have a problem with?
Well, again, for us, we're going to work with the legislature. I have a clear belief that there are going to be lawmakers who want to set a cap. As someone who personally has a junior and a sophomore in high school looking ahead to college, I want college to be affordable. And so that's not a percentage amount we've identified. It's parallel what they've done in the past, this past year and past years, about a 5.5% increase on tuition, and then they have this 3% charge on top of that. To me, I'd like to see that a bit lower, but that's something we're going to have to work with lawmakers on. It's got to be affordable. It's also why, even though we made some changes in terms of our funding, certainly we gave UW-Madison flexibility. We're open to giving other campuses flexibility. But the one thing that's been kind of glossed over is, despite all the cuts and reductions we had to make to balance our $3.6 billion deficit, we held firm the higher education system where we put in place financial aid. So for those who have true needs out there, we kept financial aid for students and families across the state intact in this budget.
Senator Tim Cullen, who you called reasonable,
I do,
in a recent interview with me, said that the one thing about you is you're trying to pass 4 years worth of change in 2 years. Are you trying to do too much?
No. In fact, I don't know if I'd say 4. It might be 4 decades worth of change in a couple months. For us, you know, I spent about 18 months in a job interview. I crisscrossed the state and sat down with voters from one end of the state to the other. I went to factories, I went to associations, I went to groups, I held town hall meetings. And what I heard time and time again was people telling us we faced a crisis in the state. We faced an economic and a fiscal crisis. And so I laid out a very clear plan about what I was going to do to get the state working again, to help the private sector create 250,000 jobs, to control government spending so that we weren't passing on the kind of debt that previous politicians in both political parties have passed on from one generation to the next. I said, we have to make a commitment to the future so our children don't face even more dire consequences than what we face. I mean, think about it. I don't think any of us out there in these tough economic times of the last couple of years have thought, yeah, I'm going to get a credit card, I'm going to ring it up, and then I'm going to hand it off to my kids. That would be totally irresponsible. And so I spent my time talking about what I was going to do, and now I'm doing it. The first 4 or 5 weeks, we had, and Tim Cullen and other Democrats joined with us in passing some of the most aggressive, bold, pro-jobs economic development pieces of legislation in the country. We then took on the budget challenge and started tackling things that provide long-term sustainable relief for both state and local governments when it comes to spending. And now we've got a budget that's not only balanced without raising taxes, balanced with incentives for economic development, but that reduces the structural deficit by 90%, $2 billion less, the lowest it's been in 16 years, Democrat and Republican alike. All those things are things I campaigned on. Now, to me, when I was in that job interview, I didn't tell people I'd wait a year or two to get it done. I said I'd start doing it right away. I said I'll start doing it January 3rd, and that's what we've done. Now, people, it may be unusual at that pace here in Madison. In fact, in many ways, sometimes it's unusual. A lot of people in the media say, we can't believe you're doing this because you're actually keeping your campaign promises. Well, people elected us to take action. When you face a crisis, you've got to take action.
The feds have said that we've got to move our primary. The local clerks, their first choice is sometime in the month of July. As you know, neighboring state of Iowa does it in June.
Yeah.
What's the best date for our primary, sir?
You know, we got to move it up, and I've thought that for years, even when I was in the legislature, that the time between the primary and the general, just for a lot of reasons, just in terms of competitive races, was important. But the most important reason with the law now is to make sure that military personnel, those men and women who serve in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, have enough time to make sure their voices are heard through the ballots. In terms of the timing, to me, that's something we can work with lawmakers. Certainly going to invoke local clerks and local election officials to try and figure out the best way to make it work, to minimize the cost and make it the most effective. But we want to do that. At the same time, we want to make sure it's a time where we're still going to get the general public to be actively engaged. You don't want to put it at a point where the masses of people are gone and miss out on that opportunity to have a full and vibrant primary season as well. So really for us, it's a matter of, again, this is not a partisan issue. I think Democrats, Republicans want to work together with this. We want to hear from the public. We want to hear from folks who deal with ballots that go overseas, most importantly, to make sure we can accommodate that and deal with local elected officials.
Well, how would you feel about in the middle of summer, during the month of July?
Well, again, it's one of those where I think we want to be careful that we do it, that it's both cost effective, it's effective for local officials, that we accommodate the concerns of public officials at the local, at the municipal level who are administering these elections. But we also want to make sure that the general public's actively engaged. I mean, in some states, you look at Illinois, you mentioned Iowa, but Illinois has a primary way back in the spring. Now, I think that's probably too early, but there might be a way of balancing that all out.
Okay. Follow-up questions on 4 specific budget issues.
Yeah.
91,000 people in Wisconsin now get senior care.
Yeah.
Under your budget, they would have to apply for Medicare Part D. Is that still the best choice? Would some of them lose benefits, Governor?
No, absolutely not. In fact, let me make that abundantly clear. My parents are seniors. My father-in-law is a senior. I look at this very seriously. Now, what we did 100% guarantees that the benefits that people get under senior care right now will continue. What we're looking at, I think, is a very responsible way of doing that, though, saying the federal government has Medicare Part D, and for all of our seniors who are on senior care and not on Medicare Part D, at least in part, we lose out on the federal government. For all of us who pay taxes in the state to the federal government, we pay taxes to fund that program. Yet none of our seniors in Wisconsin who are on senior care reap any of the benefit of that federal program. We believe first and foremost, let's get people who are eligible to apply for that, get on that, and then senior care will essentially wrap around to make sure any benefits that someone does not qualify under Medicare Part D are who's paying for it in other states. We think it's only right for us to account for those. Those are all things we're working out, how we can balance that out, how we can offset things. Again, what we want to do is wrap it around so that the benefit structure stays the same. We're just able to draw off the benefit of the federal government picking up a portion of it. Your
budget also would end the covenant program. You could no longer enroll in the covenant at the end of September.
Right.
Why?
Well, unfortunately, this is one of those examples, kind of like passing on a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit, where my predecessor made promises he just didn't plan to fulfill, or at least didn't have plans to have fulfilled. You know, there was a promise made, and we've kept. Everybody who entered, we've said as much as there really isn't money there now fully to accommodate for that, we're not going to say, hey, you sign up for something, and because times are tough, we can't pay for it. But we know long term, the funding's not there. It was never set aside. They didn't set aside an escrow account or anything like that to account for it. And in the bigger context, as I mentioned before, we fully fund higher education financial aid. Our belief is it should be needs-based so that it's not just an overall, it's not just a political ploy, which I think many would argue this was, to say, hey, great, pose for the holy pictures, get the good publicity, and then figure out how to pay for it later, so that everybody thought they were getting something. And even under the plan as Jim Doyle funded it, depending on where your income level was, in some cases you got next to nothing versus others out there who got more. let's be honest about financial aid. Financial aid needs to be need-based. It needs to go to families that otherwise would have a challenge sending their son or daughter or kids to school here in the state of Wisconsin. We need to do that at the same time as we talked about before. We need to make sure overall that higher education is affordable. But setting up a program that just gives a blanket promise without the funding to back it up is exactly the kind of trouble we've gotten in the past with the budget.
Why is the farmland preservation program broken? Your budget would end it.
Yeah, for us, one of the best ways to preserve farmland is something I supported more than a decade ago. It's use value assessment in the state. The use value assessment says that particularly in urban areas, say it's around Madison or Milwaukee or Waukesha counties where there's farmland around areas of rapid development, the use value system says we're not going to value at a higher level when it comes to assessments. We're going to protect you at what the true costs are in terms of the value of that land for farming versus the higher costs, at least in years past, when it came to development. That's the most effective way of protecting farmland. What you had in the past with this particular program, and the program itself isn't eliminated in terms of managing lands that relate to farmland and agricultural land, but the conversion fee that was said, if you do go from a point where, say, someone who's got no one to pass it on, they don't have a family member to pass it on from one generation to the next, decides instead of selling it off for farmland, they want to develop that. In the past, there's been a conversion fee that makes it almost prohibitive for someone to do that. The new developer, if under our plan, you get rid of that conversion fee, you get rid of that additional funding amount out there, and if someone were to develop it, which is very limited because they'll be paying the higher assessed value, but they have that option out there without paying the higher fee.
Some members of your party and some local government leaders want to continue the recycling grants. Mm-hmm. Your budget would also do away with that. Are you open to keeping those grants?
Yeah, I've talked to lawmakers about that, but they need to remember a couple things. They need to, if they're going to put any more money back in this or any other program, so you're not getting it through higher taxes. I'm protecting middle-class taxpayers. I'm not going to have that piled onto them. If they want to make it by savings elsewhere, we're perfectly open to it. We recycle at our home. My home in Wauwatosa as well as my home or the People's Home in Maple Bluff. So this is not about recycling. It was literally about going through and saying for years, local officials have complained about mandates from state government. I went through and you can see at the state, at the city, the municipal level, as well as the school districts, we eliminated nearly every mandate out there. This was one of those. It's one of those where apparently local officials still would like to have that mandate along with the funding. And again, if we can find another way to pay for it, we can work with that. But remember, nearly 2 decades ago, you remember you were in the Capitol covering this, when this original idea was put up there by Spencer Black and others, they said they needed a mandate and a temporary funding source to create a market. And once the market was created, it would be self-sustainable. Mm-hmm. That was nearly 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. That's a good example why people in this Capitol need to be cautious when someone says, just do this for a little bit of time and then it'll self-sustain itself. It's 2 decades later and it doesn't now because what they're saying is we can't do this without these funds. I believe they could. I believe there are markets out there. But again, on this, we're willing to work with lawmakers as long as they're not raising taxes to fill in the gap.
And my last question deals with presidential politics.
Yeah.
The former governor of Minnesota has now become the first announced member of your party to run. Are you getting calls from Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin asking for their endorsements?
I haven't. It's a wide open field, but I think having a proven executive is the right course, not just for the party, but the right course for the country. And we'll be watching closely.
And you don't plan to run, correct?
No, I'm focused. My goal is about as clear as it can get. I'm in Wisconsin to help the people of the state create 250,000 jobs between now and 2015.
Governor Scott Walker, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.